So welcome everybody. My name is Parker Menzimer. I'm the Public Programs Director here at the Poetry Society. And this evening I have the pleasure of welcoming and introducing our speaker. And to the guests joining on the live stream, thank you so much for tuning in as well. So for those of you who have not joined us in this space or have never been to a Poetry Society program, just a few quick words. The PSA was founded in 1910 in New York and has undergone many evolutions and changes in that 100+ years. But over that time, it's maintained a commitment to uplifting and celebrating poetry. And in this kind of new-ish Brooklyn space now, we are working on growing a place for poetry in the public imagination. I'm so excited for this evening's talk, which has the promise of demonstrating some of poetry's primary virtues, its way of binding us together in community and communities, its fellowship with intellectual inquiry, and its symbiotic relationship to friendship, and with friendship, even gossip. This evening, we are joined by Ron Padgett, one of poetry's greatest champions, whose talk addresses two writers who thoroughly exemplified the closeness of friendship and poetry, Kenneth, Koch, and Frank O'Hara. After this evening's lecture, we'll open the floor for a 15-minute Q&A from the audience gathered here in the space. And after that, we'll be stacking chairs, and we'll encourage you to have another drink and buy a book and have a chat. This evening, we do have copies of Ron Padgett's latest collection of poetry, Pink Dust. And thanks to our friends at the CUNY Grad Center, we also have a very unique collection of Koch and O'Hara's correspondences. This is part of the CUNY Lost and Found series, archival recovery series that they do that's really wonderful. It's a 2-volume set for $15, so at least check it out because it's really interesting and you might not find it in many bookstores. The Poetry Society is a nonprofit organization, so thank you for supporting us by being here this evening. It means so much. So without further ado, I will be introducing our speaker. I will tell you that I had to work up the gumption to cold email Ron Padgett for a talk. For as long as I have been a reader of poetry, I have known Ron Padgett's work. He has been there for so many of us, like an inarguable fact, modeling a life in poetry. And not only as a poet, although he has been particularly prolific as a poet, having published upward of 20 volumes of his own poetry now. But he's also a consummate person of letters, having championed, edited, anthologized, and taught so many of the writers we now recognize as greats, in part thanks to his work. Like any truly consummate person of letters, Padgett works in many modes, also as a memoirist and translator, having brought into English major 20th century French poets, including Apollinaire, Pierre Reverdy, Blaise Cendrars. And fans of the filmmaker Jim Jarmusch might like to know that Padgett's poems feature in the movie Paterson. When Ron suggested a talk on the friendship of Koch and O'Hara, I was thrilled by his suggestion of a topic that speaks so directly to the spirit of this series, illuminating how affiliation, both personal and aesthetic, is central to the practice of poetry. Pink Dust, Padgett's latest collection of poems, exemplifies his conversational New York school style. His poems often seem to be conversing directly with you, the reader, or else with a fellow poet, or else with the whole tradition of poetry. And I think this is what we expect from our teachers, fluency with a tradition that would seem increasingly obscure without their guidance. In his poem, A Brief Guide to 20th Century American Poetry, which is a poem in Pink Dust, Padgett writes, "Pound was a verb, Eliot was a noun, they sentenced us to modernity." Padgett tonight will be discussing two key inheritors of literary modernity, Kenneth Koch, born in Cincinnati, Ohio in 1925, and Frank O'Hara, born in Baltimore in 1926. Each is known in his own way for figuring poetry as an exercise in communication. O'Hara's talky poems addressed the real world in fresh, bantering terms, freeing the art of poetic description from Keats's Grecian urn. And Koch was not only the poet who wrote passionate addresses to railroad stations, pennants, evenings, and lumber yards. He was also a great teacher whose pedagogical ideas foregrounded the democratic potentials of poetry. Tonight, we have the honor of hearing from a great poet and New Yorker who has been a Pulitzer Prize finalist and received a Guggenheim Fellowship, the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, and the Frost Medal, which is the Poetry Society's own Lifetime Achievement Award, but whose contributions to poetry really are much greater than can be suggested by simple enumeration. So please join me in welcoming our speaker, Ron Padgett.
You're a tall guy.
Oh, that looks like it's just about right.
Thank you for coming tonight. I'm going to read this talk. It's not a lecture, it's a talk about Frank O'Hara and Kenneth Koch, and it's called The Beauty and Uses of Literary Friendship. In 1949, Harvard undergraduate John Ashbery wrote to recent graduate Kenneth Koch about the poetry of a fellow student, Francis O'Hara. John wrote to Kenneth, "I think there's a new contender here." Shortly thereafter, Ashbery mailed Koch a manuscript of O'Hara's poems, which Koch found not very interesting. But he took it with him when, in the late summer of 1950, he went to France for a year. And when he read the manuscript again, he was staggered by it. Thus began an inspiring, competitive literary friendship that helped both Koch and O'Hara become two of the greatest American poets of the 20th century. Enough time has passed since O'Hara's early death for him to become legendary, thanks in part to a full-length biography, numerous book and magazine critical studies, television exposure, and the ever-growing public admiration for his most accessible collection, Lunch Poems. Despite all this attention, many commentaries have minimized or even ignored his relationship with Koch. Joseph Lesueur, who was Frank's housemate from 1955 to 1965, wrote a delightful and informative memoir in which he said that Kenneth was not an intimate friend of Frank's, but a literary one. I don't want to quibble with Joe's use of the word intimate, for though it's true that Kenneth was not Frank's lover, and that during certain periods Kenneth didn't see Frank frequently, Lesueur's statement suggests that literary friendship is by definition distant. What Joe missed is that for both Frank and Kenneth, poetry was at the very center of their lives. In fact, the original draft of Frank's statement, written in 1959 for Donald Allen's New American Poetry Anthology, Frank's statement came right out with it. "Poetry is life to me." And Kenneth, later, referring to writing and life, asks in his poem Days and Nights, "For me, have the two things become mostly the same?" Mostly. Poetry was at the heart of who they were, a bond that I see as deeply intimate. I would like now to go back and track that intimacy beginning in 1950 with Kenneth's awakening to Frank's genius. You'll remember that in that year after Koch graduated, Ashbery sent him some of Frank's poems, along with the contender note. And Kenneth later summarized his reaction. "I read the poems on the train to Vienna, then I suddenly got illuminated. I was very excited about them, also very intimidated. I believe I liked them for the same reasons I had not liked them before. That is, because they were sassy, colloquial, and full of realistic detail. I was moved by the fact that he used a lot of exclamation marks. This seems a small thing, but I hadn't had exclamation marks in my poetry before. But O'Hara's poetry and his friendship were to have a much deeper influence on Kenneth, and vice versa. It was in 1951 that Kenneth, back from his year in France, first met Frank. Kenneth's poem called Fate, written many years later, describes his telling his friends, Frank, John Ashbery, and Jane Freilacher, about Kenneth's experiences in Europe. And here's the excerpt from that poem, Fate. "I told my friends about Europe. They'd never been there, how much I loved it. I was so happy to be there with them in my Europe, too, which I had. Greece, Italy, France, Scandinavia, and England. Imagine having all that the first time. The walls were white in that little apartment, so tiny. The rooms are all so small, but we all fitted into one and talked. Frank, so sure of his talent, but didn't say it that way. I didn't know till after he was dead just how sure he had been. And they tended, except Frank, to pooh-pooh what I said about Europe. And even Frank was more interested, but ever polite. Kenneth went on to Berkeley for a year of graduate work, and when he moved back to New York in 1952, his friendship with Frank took off. Looking back three decades later, Kenneth wrote, "As I think about it now, the best thing about our friendship was itself. That is, our friendship. That he and John and I and whoever else were together, walking on the air. We were as though in Dante's boat. It hardly mattered what we said. It was the level on which we said it." Frank and Kenneth began spending a lot of time together. They had been around each other for only a few months when, in July of 1952, they wrote their first poem together, a sestina, as described later by Kenneth. "This was the first time I had written a poem with somebody else, and also the first time I had been able to write a good sestina. The reason was that Frank's example gave me the clue to what had been wrong with all the other formal pieces I'd attempted. They were all a little distant and pretentious." Frank's relaxed attitude about writing represented what seemed an absolute break with the whole tradition of the separateness of artistic creation, of the whole holy hush conception of the making of a poem. Other collaborations followed, though the example I'm going to give you here, description, is not a direct collaboration, but it's leading toward it. Kenneth wrote, "That fall," I think this is 1952, "Frank came to my apartment on several evenings and we wrote against each other. I had 2 typewriters, and on them we composed separate poems simultaneously and as fast as possible." More would come later. And here's something else that Kenneth said about collaborating with Frank. Well, he was actually responding to a letter someone had sent him and asked him, and he was answering and saying, "When Frank and I write together, we get terribly enthusiastic, so much so that our collaborative poems seem as though they were written by one person." Their mutual enthusiasm took its most extended form in 2 long poems, Kenneth's poem, "When the Sun Tries to Go On," and Frank's Second Avenue. About that, Kenneth said, "Frank and I both wrote long poems in 1953. I had no clear intention of writing a 2,400-line poem, which it turned out to be, before Frank said to me on seeing the first 72 lines, which I regarded as a poem by itself, Frank said, 'Why don't you go on with it as long as you can?' Frank at this time decided to write a long poem too. While we were writing our long poems, we would read each other the results daily over the telephone. This seemed to inspire us a good deal." Although these 2 poems are quite different, they share the energy and momentum of epic ambition. Frank's poem is only 12 pages long, but it has a much greater scale of feeling than a page count would suggest. So far as I know, these are the 2 longest poems these poets had ever written. In any case, it's unlikely that they would have written them had they not had the other fellow across town writing like mad. Kenneth was by nature quite competitive. Anyone who played tennis with him will attest to that. Though what matters here is that winning or losing, mainly he just enjoyed the game itself. And by the way, more than once, after hearing that I had given a poetry reading with someone, he asked me with a smile, "Did you win?" Now, and here's a revealing passage about competitiveness. Here's a revealing passage in some notes that he made in the 1980s, measuring himself against O'Hara. "Frank brought poetry so close to his everyday existence that it was enough to make you sick with envy, despair, or inspiration." And as for measuring themselves against others, Kenneth wrote, "It was odd being in the presence of this undoubtedly essential and immortal friend, which he might not like me to say, since, alive, he said, 'No, we're not great. When we've done as much as Williams or as Stevens, maybe we can say that we're great.'" Even after Frank was long dead, Kenneth respected his friend's reluctance to classify himself as great, even though Kenneth had no doubt about Frank's having done as much as Williams or Stevens. Kenneth owed a lot to Frank, but the debt was reciprocal. Shortly after Second Avenue, Frank wrote a poem called Three Poems About Kenneth Koch, and here are just some excerpts. He's talking to Kenneth. "May I tell you how much I love your poems? It's as if a great pipeline had been illicitly tapped, along which all personal characteristics are making a hasty departure. Tube, gin, qu'importe où. Oh, Kenneth Koch." Another excerpt. "Under the careful care of our admiration, his greatness appears, like the French for gratuitous act. And we're proud of our Hermes, the fastest literary figure of his time." And then later, "Gee, I'm really depressed. My black back. And now, a telephone. Hello, Kenneth." These are examples not only of Frank's admiration for Kenneth's work, but also of how Frank, when his spirits darkened, turned to Kenneth. When Kenneth's first collection came out, Frank wrote him this following note in September of 1953. "Dear Kenny, I would like to heap effusions on you this morning, but why? That would be merely to repeat my sincerest compliments on your work yet another time. My delight in and admiration of your work and yourself is so complete that it is in itself a limitation to expressing it. And all I can do is remind you of what you already know of my feelings and tell you that they're even stronger now and more inspired, and that your book is making me very, very happy. Love, Frank." In 1954, the next year, Kenneth married Janice Elwood, and using an inheritance from his own uncle and from Janice's Fulbright, the two went to Europe for a year. Frank commemorated their departure with a poem called For Janice and Kenneth to Voyage. "Love, love, love. Honeymoon isn't used much in poetry these days. And if I give you a bar of Palmolive soap, it would be rather Cracker Barrel of me, wouldn't it? The winds will wash you out of your hair, my dears. Passions will become turrets to you. I'll be so afraid without you. The penalty of the big town is the big stick. And when you were laughing nearby, the monsters ignored me like a record player, and I felt brilliant to be so confident that the trees would walk back to Burnham Wood. It was all you, your graceful white smiles, like a French word, the one for money, the one for brine." Notice that Frank says he feels safer, more confident, and brilliant when Kenneth and Janice are with him. Meanwhile, Kenneth's admiration of Frank's work burned ever brighter, as seen in this letter from Paris, dated December 23rd, 1954. "Dear Frank, I just read your poems in the November issue of Poetry magazine a few days ago in the Bibliothèque, and they absolutely set me on fire. They all seem wonderful and fresh and true and brilliant and hopeless and invincible and beautiful. They are terribly moving, like long tragedies, and at the same time so absolutely mercurial and evanescent and bright. They've really put me in quite a state. Love, Kenneth." In May that year, Frank wrote, it was in New York, wrote to Kenneth in Paris, "Send me another delicious postcard, a note, some poems. I love the ones you sent John Ashbery, especially Geography and the Circus. As you always do, you give me the feeling about your works that Alps on Alps arise, or whatever that line is. And I looked that up. It's from Alexander Pope, his essay on criticism. Anyway, several weeks later, Frank wrote again to Kenneth, "It was such a joy to write, as I have been in a drought with English, the likes of which hasn't been seen since Koch last went to Europe. Hurry back, or I'll forget my poetic grammar." Kenneth responded, telling Frank that Frank, had the ability to keep one always jumping around in one's seat while reading your poems, along with other still undiscovered sublime characteristics. I hope you are really writing a lot of poems in spite of what you say to the contrary. At any rate, we can write 1,000,000 when I get back. Frank yearned to see more of Kenneth's new work. Frank wrote to him, "I await your poems with as much anticipation as a buzz bomb loaded with unpublished lyrics by Leopardi." And I don't happen to have seen any load of poems from the Koch mill lately, by the way, and my production is faltering as a result. Kenneth complied by sending him a poem called Collected Poems, which inspired Frank to write a counterpart poem, which he called Collected Proses. In a letter to Kenneth, Frank described the genesis of his version, the Collected Proses. Frank wrote, "What a joy it was to get your sweet letter and your sizzling poems. As you will see, I came to work at Museum of Modern Art. I came to work and immediately threw everything off my desk so I could write a collected prose accompaniment to your objective rhapsody, which may very well be the most moving piece of insight since Tinder buttons." Frank continued to be aware of Kenneth's influence on his writing, as shown in this letter following letter from Cambridge, Massachusetts, where Frank had gone temporarily on a Rockefeller grant to write for the Poets Theater. Frank wrote, "I couldn't get down to New York this time because of money and depression and not having accomplished anything here. Naturally, I miss you very much and wish the poetry wires would start humming between us." Years later, Kenneth jotted down the following notes about Frank and himself as they were in the mid-1950s. Kenneth wrote, and this is unpublished and notational, "We were about 30, zonk, and we had maximum inside-outside power. The world seemed real. Frank made it a bigger one, and our energy supply was great. Exclamations, enthusiasm, excitement, high and epic ambitions. Frank's admiration of me, better than being the laureate. Frank made me feel stronger, nobler, capable. I like to make him detached from his usual reality and sillier." In several instances, Kenneth succeeded, to his own dismay, in getting Frank to be sillier. I'm thinking in particular of a play by Frank and Larry Rivers called Kenneth Koch, A Tragedy, a witty, campy satire that poked fun at his subject. Works that expose a friend's peccadillos and still remain funny and warm can be written only by a close friend. Throughout the 1950s, Frank relied on Kenneth to cheer him up personally and to encourage and inspire him poetically, as in this following poem, written while Frank was in New York City and Kenneth and Janice Koch were house-sitting out in Southampton, New York, house-sitting the Fairfield and Ann Porter home. This is in August of 1959, and I'll read Frank's entire poem. It's, about Kenneth. This is called Poem. The fluorescent tubing burns like a Bobby Soxer's ankles. The white paint, the green leaves in an old champagne bottle, and the Formica shelves going up in the office, and the Formica desktops over the white floor. What kind of an office is this anyway? I'm so nervous about my life, the little of it I can get hold of. So I call up Kenneth in Southampton, and presto, he is leaning on the shelf in the kitchen 3 hours away, while Janice is drying her hair, which has prevented her from hearing my voice through the telephone company ear blacker. All telephones were black at the time. Why black a clean ear? Kenneth, you are really the backbone of a tremendous poetry nervous system, which keeps sending messages along the wireless luxuriance of distraught experiences and hysterical desires, so to keep things humming and have nothing go off the trackless tracks. And once more, you have balanced me precariously on the wilderness wish of wanting to be everything to everybody everywhere, as the vigor of Africa through the corridor, the sands of Sahara still tickle in my jockey shorts, the air conditioner grunts like that Eskimo dad, and the phone clicks as your glasses bump the receiver to say, we are in America, and it is all right not to be elsewhere. Kenneth was not only, in general, the, quote, backbone of a tremendous poetry nervous system, but specifically, he was also instrumental in convincing Frank to change the title of his poem from Meditations on a Reemergence to Meditations in an Emergency, which later became the title of Frank's first major collection. And Kenneth convinced Frank to keep the title that Lawrence Ferlinghetti had suggested for another collection, Lunch Poems, whose contents Kenneth helped Frank select. In the following years, whenever one of them was out of town, their correspondence continued, warm, chatty, witty, and enthusiastic. The latest letter, or the last extant letter, is from the summer of 1961, after Frank had visited the Kochs in Southampton. And Frank wrote this letter, thank you both, Kenneth and Janice. Thank you both for a perfectly ripping time and for all the wonderful things we did and said, and the secret little smiles that kept flitting like hummingbirds across the several rooms and lawns between us. And golly, here I am crying, but I'm happy. Isn't that silly of me? I guess I just miss you both. It's possible that Frank's being so moved was due in part to the fact that beginning around 1960, Frank had been seeing less of the Kochs. The year before, Kenneth had become engrossed in his teaching position at Columbia, and he had a wife and now a 5-year-old daughter, hence far less free time. Two other people of their tight circle were also less present. Jane Freilicher had entered into a settled married life, and John Ashbery had moved to Paris. In addition, Kenneth grew increasingly annoyed by what he saw as Frank's indiscriminate choice of acquaintances, some of whom were either mentally unstable, macho heavy drinkers, or gay men somewhat insulated in their own private clique where Kenneth didn't quite fit in. And Frank, who was both highly gregarious and subject to gloom in solitude, sought solace in an increasingly wide variety of acquaintances, which had the effect of cutting him off from Kenneth. I've lost the exact reference now, but somewhere Kenneth wrote about having wanted to have a greater lean on Frank's attention, which he didn't want to share with, Kenneth didn't want to share with people that Kenneth, didn't like being around. Though Kenneth and Frank saw each other less often, I believe that their mutual affection and respect never faltered. I'm thinking particularly of one evening in 1964 or 65, when Kenneth, Janice, my wife, and I had dinner at Frank and Joe's. After dinner, Kenneth and Frank quickly got into a witty and jostling conversation off on their own across the room that lasted much of the evening. It's the kind of conversation that only old friends can have. When Kenneth got the news of Frank's death in 1966, he rushed with Larry Rivers and Frank Lima to O'Hara's loft to make sure that none of Frank's manuscripts went astray. As Kenneth looked through them, he wept. In subsequent years, Kenneth began to write directly about Frank in essays, memoirs, and poems that are clear-minded, perceptive, original, and moving. In his poem, The Circus, this is the second one of that title, Kenneth wrote about Frank and his other few close friends from the 1950s, and there is no doubt that Kenneth's writing directly about his feelings was yet another example of Frank's influence. And here's an excerpt from this Kenneth's poem. I never mentioned my friends in my poems at the time I wrote the first circus, although they meant almost more than anything to me. Of this now, for some time, I've felt an attenuation, so I'm mentioning them. Maybe this will bring them back to me. Not them, perhaps, but what I felt about them. John Ashbery, Jane Freilich, Larry Rivers, Frank O'Hara. Their names alone bring tears to my eyes. Kenneth had finally received one of Frank's great gifts, the ability to write poetry that is as direct and emotional as it is exciting and beautiful. And finally, here's a short, unpublished poem by Kenneth, which he sent to Frank in a letter in 1957 or 1958. It's a short poem. It's called To Frank O'Hara. When you and I are old, we too shall be famous. You will wear a white beret, and I will wear a red one. We will read our verses to admiring students, and they will carry us down among the hedgerows, wreathed in flowers. Thank you. Thank you. I think there's going to be a question and answer thing.
Yeah,
okay.
We're going to open the floor for 15 minutes.
I love the idea of opening a floor. Right here, by the way.
There's a pool.
Boom.
There's a pool. All just sort of be dumped in.
Yeah, good. Okay, should we do it now?
Yeah.
Good.
Anyone want to start us off?
Oh, before, I'm sorry. I wanted to give credit to the New York Public Library's Berg collection, where I drew many of these references. Some are from Frank and Kenneth's letters, which I had access to. And this, by the way, this publication that was mentioned earlier that the CUNY people did. What's the kid's name that did that? Jason something? Schinderman, yeah. Jason Schinderman, he did a great job on this, by the way. It's a wonderful little collection, and you can't get them anywhere else, so it's pretty good. Anyway, I just want to credit the Berg collection because they were very, very helpful and nice. And Kenneth Koch's archive, which there, it's something like, I don't know, it's like 120 linear feet or something, isn't it? I mean, it's humongous. It's an incredible treasure trove. And I had a lot of pleasure sitting there pawing through it, trying to find things like this to say. Okay, I'm sorry. Questions? I once went to a talk that Salvador Dali gave at Columbia in this huge auditorium. And he got up and he was Dali. This is about 1970 maybe, I don't know. And he was Dali. And he showed the pictures and stuff, and he said some things. I don't know what he said, but at the end, the host came out and said, "Thank you, Mr. Dali. We're wonderful evening, and now we will take questions from the audience." And there was an auditorium had like 700 people in it. Stone silence. I was sitting in the front row, and being a smart aleck, I held up my hand, and the guy said, "Yes, sir." And I said, "Mr. Dali, why are you having a question and answer period?" And he was great. He said, "Because there are no questions." So I just had a Salvador Dali moment there.
Don't be like Dali's audience. Feel free to raise your hand.
Yes.
Oh, I'm going to be shuttling the microphone so that folks on the live stream
Yeah, do you want to?
question. So it'll be a little awkward, but those in the ether will appreciate it.
That was wonderful talk. I'm just wondering, it sounds like you knew Kenneth Koch, and did you know Frank O'Hara, and how did you come to know them?
Yes, I did know. No, I never met either one of them. No, I had the good fortune when I was an undergraduate, I came to school, and Kenneth Koch was assigned to me as a professor in a year-long humanities course kind of a great books course. And so I knew his poetry before, 'cause in high school in Oklahoma, I had read some of his poems in some little magazines at the time. And so I knew about his work, but I'd sort of lost my sense of humor by the time I got to high school. And so Kenneth's work didn't really ring a bell. But when I saw him teach and heard him teach, many people have attested to what a charismatic, great, inspiring teacher he was. And so I was his student, and I was enraptured by his brilliance and his spontaneity. And so from that, he found out I wrote poetry, and he got to know me outside of class, and he became kind of a mentor. And then we developed a friendship over the years, and we became, really good friends. And we played tennis together and whatnot. And as far as Frank goes, I met Frank, I think it was in 62, I think. I'd seen him. I'd gone to a poetry reading he'd given, but I can't remember exactly how I met him. It just seemed so easy. Because that milieu, Frank and John Ashbery, though, was in Europe at the time, living in Paris. But my friend Joe Brainerd had fallen in with Frank's roommate, Joe LeSueur, whom I mentioned earlier, and whom I quibbled with in this essay. I shouldn't have really. I just used him as an excuse to quibble. But Joe LeSueur was a terrific guy. I really liked him. And anyway, Joe Brainerd and Joe LeSueur developed a relationship and immediately met Frank. And then there was Ted Berrigan, the poet, who's a friend of ours, Joe Brainerd and mine. And he had written to Frank, and Frank had written him back. So, and Frank was living down in the Lower East Side, as Ted was and Joe was, and I was up at Columbia, but I was down there all the time. So it was very easy at that time, though, to sort of meet people. And if you went to a gallery opening, you go to a Philip Guston opening, and you could just be introduced to all kinds of people. And I have to say that the older people, the older painters and the older poets, were incredibly welcoming to us young hicks. And so it just seemed normal. I mean, now in retrospect, it seems like a miracle. But then it just seemed like that's what happens. You come to New York and you get to meet all these amazing people, and they're nice to you, And but that's how I got. But then Frank's life was cut short in July of '66. So I was just thinking about him today. Before coming here, I was changing my pants in my apartment, and I took off the sweatpants I had, and I was going to was at a party at Joe LeSueur's. Joe had rented a little apartment on 2nd Avenue and lived there, very small, and it was in the summer of '65, and it was a very small, and I was there, and Joe Brainerd and Kenneth, and it was crowded because it was a small apartment. Finally, it was time for me and my wife to leave, and so I went into the bedroom to get my jacket, and there is Joe LeSueur and Frank is standing there with his pants down. And Frank looked over at me and my wife and said, "Oh dear, what will they think of us now?" And it turns out Frank was changing his pants because he was going uptown to MoMA for a big fancy occasion. There was nothing sexual about it at all. But it was so funny. We turned into, what will they think of us now? So this happened today when you were ringing my buzzer. I thought, what will they think of us now? Oh my God, I'm sorry. Does somebody else have a question? Yeah.
We're going to go all the way in the back.
Me all the way in the back? Mr. Dali. Hi, Ron. I was thinking about, I've been thinking a lot about Kenneth's teaching to kids lately, and with all of the collaborations and inspirations between Frank and Kenneth, I was wondering if they ever talked about like the teaching that Kenneth was doing, or if Frank ever had any relationship with that himself. and also if that was like part of that kind of Scrabbly inspiration dynamic.
He has to walk all this way back to the microphone for me to say I don't know. But you know, collaboration was in the air in the 50s. Like Kenneth did some poetry and jazz readings at the 5 Spot, and actually, who was it? Somebody, was it Larry Rivers playing the saxophone? I can't remember. And Kenneth improvised by reading the New York telephone book, and Billie Holiday was there, and she leaned against the after it was over, Kenneth came over, and she leaned over to him and said, "Man, that is some crazy shit." But also, you know, Frank O'Hara and Larry Rivers collaborated on some poem pictures, lithographs, and Frank collaborated with Mike Goldberg and Norman Bloom, other artists, and then he wrote plays. He wrote some plays with Larry and some other people. So it was very much in the air, at least downtown. I don't think any of the more mainstream poets were doing that. And then Kenneth edited an issue of a little magazine called Locus Solus. The second issue, I believe, was dedicated entirely to the history of literary collaboration, going way back and all around the world. That was a wonderful, inspiring thing. I think that came out in '62, maybe, something like that. And so it was a big turn on. And, you know, it was very inspiring to a lot of the younger writers who liked them. But it didn't seem odd to be writing. I mean, you know, Frank was a very social being, and Kenneth was very gregarious. And so when all those people got together, you know, the wit flew thick and fast, let me tell you. I mean, it was astounding how funny all those people and how quick they were. John Ashbery, the wittiest of all was Jane Freilacher, the artist. She had a wit that was out of this world. But they all did. And everybody was so bubbly and, you know, fast. And a little bit one-upmanship in there, too. But it was fun. And it was fun to be there as the fly on the wall, you know. I came from Oklahoma where people didn't talk like that, you know, and it was really quite something. But there was almost a form of literary happening collaboration at those parties, which all tended to happen in small apartments or artist loft where people are crowded in and having a good time and getting ripped out of their mind. And so I was going to say something else about collaboration. No, that's enough.
Somewhere. Did I see a hand up over here?
Yeah, I was also wondering about how funny they were, and I was thinking in particular of Kenneth Koch being so interested in parody, and I was just curious if you had thoughts about memories of them being funny, but you've already have sort of talked about it, yeah.
So I've already answered your question.
Well, you're welcome to elaborate.
Okay.
I mean, I guess I'm curious if they parodied other.
Actually, I don't think Frank in his writing, I don't recall him parodying anybody.
Yeah.
But he certainly could take different voices. But Kenneth wrote some parodies, which were by and large very affectionate. One of William Carlos Williams, for example, the most famous one. Yeah. But he also wrote a very funny one, I think, a parody of Ezra Pound, which I think is really funny. I don't know if that's been reprinted, but Kenneth was a very, very, let me just go back. All these people were extremely witty and fast, and it was it was great. And I said earlier that, I'm going to talk about myself a moment, that I'd lost my sense of humor by the time I got to high school, but I had a great sense of humor when I was a kid. And when I got to high school, things got kind of serious. And I came to New York, and Kenneth helped me rediscover not only my own sense of humor, but also the whole history of comic writing and all of literature. And suddenly I thought, it's not all Dostoevsky, and I mean, there's farting in Greek tragedy, in Greek comedies, for example, and things like that, and it was it was so relaxing to be able to allow yourself to have a sense of humor. It's like smiling. If you smile, even if you feel bad, if you smile, you'll feel better, just for a moment. But it does change you, just smiling. It's the weirdest thing. And so Kenneth really helped me and a lot of other people that way. And of course, it can lead to excess and bad humor and bad jokes and jokiness and things like. Of course, you run off the rails. You're a writer. If you're trying things, you're gonna make mistakes. But it's big deal. Who cares?
Hi, Ron. I was curious if you ever gave a stack of poems to Kenneth or to Frank, and if you received notations or comments on poems, and if you still have those. I'm just curious, what those comments might have sounded like, if that was the case.
Did you hear his question okay? Yeah. I never gave Frank. I didn't have the courage to do that. I wouldn't have done that. But I just in the talk I gave, I talked about going to dinner. My wife and I went up and had dinner with Frank and Joe Lesueur and Kenneth and Janice. And I remember going to the building. It was 791 Broadway, across from the Grace Church, and they were in a loft. It was, I think, the third floor, second or third. But anyway, old loft building, small. And we buzz downstairs and we go up this crickety, this long flights of stairs. We get up finally, and I look down the hall, and the door is open, lights coming out, and Frank's standing in the doorway smiling. And as we walked down toward him, as I got up to him, he looked at me with a great radiant smile, and he said, "I like your poetry." And I said, I like yours too. And he burst out laughing in the most warm, welcoming way possible. But that was as close as I ever got to, I figured, quit while you're ahead. But with Kenneth, he was my teacher, and I even had a private seminar with him one semester, in which I met with him once a week, and ostensibly it was about a translation seminar, but he asked me to bring in poems too, so I did show him poems, yeah, and as inspiring and generous as he was also a very tough critic. He didn't stand for any nonsense, anything that seemed false or wrong or clunky or insincere or misguided or trite, vulgar. He didn't go for it, and he said so in no uncertain terms. Yeah, he'd lower the boom sometimes. He'd look at a woman and say, you really want me to read this? But when he saw something he liked, he lit up, and beneath or supporting all of his harsher criticism, which was well-deserved, by the way, was a feeling that I could trust him and that he didn't mean me ill by saying those things. And he wasn't trying to make me feel bad or defeat me or show that he knew more. He wasn't smarty-pantsing it over me or anything. He was really trying to help, but he had to be a little mean, and it was really good, yeah. And I do have a few poems with his comments on them that he had written earlier. And I think I do. I think they're in the Beinecke Library. I have some art papers there, and I think they're in there. I put them in there. Anyway.
If you're up for it, maybe one more. Sure. Do you have it in you? Okay, one more question.
Maybe you can do two, because this is... Oh, there's a question in it. That's true. Yeah, I mean, I guess I found your talk extremely illuminating. Being more familiar with Kenneth Koch and his work than Frank O'Hara, actually. So my real interest here is in their collaborations at this point, and I wondered, I may have missed it, you may have already said this, but So are there collections? And if so, what would be the names of the collections of their collaborations?
I don't believe that they've ever been collected. I don't know if there are that many. I've never done a page count, and I confess, in Kenneth's archive at the Berg, I didn't go through the 120 feet of papers. I mean, it's really staggering. But would be a good project for someone to put together and write about it, I think. Yeah. Yeah. Can we have one more question?
I think I passed over someone in the back with a tall hand.
Hi. I was actually wondering about what kinds of jewels you found at Kenneth's archive. Could you talk a little about the different stuff that you got excited about in there?
There are a lot of things up there that are pretty great. It's very interesting to look, for example, at Kenneth's revisions. He was he wrote very quickly, and he had very often very expansively, and then he would go back and mercilessly critique his own work, just as he had mercilessly critiqued mine. He was just as severe on himself, and it was great to go back and find like a 40-page manuscript that he had cut down to 10 pages or 8 pages, and just slashing out whole pages. Some of which were pretty good, actually. So it was interesting to see as graphic demonstration of how he reworked his own work. That's true of a lot of archives, right? But also there are some childhood items in his archive that are really great, and a letter from his mother, for example, and some photographs, and then the correspondence to and from Frank and to others. He corresponded with Ashbery a lot because John was in France for a long time. And but I would say, let me see. Yeah, I'd say those were the highlights. But again, I just scratched the surface. And I'd gone up to the Berg wanting to find more. Everything I said in my talk tonight, I already felt. I was already convinced of it. And I just needed to go find corroborating evidence, that's all. And because if I just make an assertion, yeah, who's he? So my focus was on finding this kind of material between Frank and Kenneth. But while I was there, I took a little sneak peek at other stuff too. But I just scratched the surface. Oh, I think, in fact, I think today may have been the last day. There was a very nice big display from Kenneth's archive at the New York Public Library, up there on the 3rd floor, by the main reading room. It was a little homage to Kenneth because this is the centenary of his birth. And it was a very lovely thing. Anyway, long live the archives. Is that it? Okay. Thank you, everybody.